A question that has fascinated scholars for decades is how did the Nazis take control over Germany, a liberal democracy prior to Nazi takeover? The swift rise of a violent and authoritarian regime has remained as an enduring warning to every liberal democracy in the world. Through realizing the reasons for Nazi Germany's rise, we can seek to avoid the rise of another regime like it ever again. There are two key phases to the Nazi takeover of Germany: the rise of the Nazis and their consolidation of power. The Nazis rose to power due to three main reasons: the Nazis' exploitation of weaknesses within the Weimar Republic, their capitalization upon destabilizing events within Germany, and the effective appeal of the Nazis. The Weimar Republic was a bold political experiment in which ambitious liberal reformers attempted to implement one of the world's most liberal constitutions upon a country which had only known authoritarian rule. This would cause social unrest among the conservative rural side and the conservative elites, such as Ludendorff, who were uneasy about the new progressive policies of the SPD-led government. From the Republic's inception, discontent was already simmering, whether from the left or the right, as evident in the multiple revolutions in Weimar's early years, such as the Bavarian Soviet Republic of April 1919. This revolution was important, as its leadership were primarily Jewish, such as Eugen Levine. This would lead to an insidious linking between the hated Bolshevism and Judaism, fueling a rise in anti-Semitism, which would culminate in the devastating rise of the Nazis, who were able to capitalize upon this anti-Semitism within Germany and use it to fuel their rise in popularity. This would eventually lead to the Holocaust. This revolution was crushed by the right-wing Freikorps, who had previously crushed the Spartacist uprising in January 1919. This was important, this previous uprising, as the socialist SPD had signed the Ebert-Groener Pact with the military, in which they both supported each other to crush revolutions against the Weimar Republic. Consequently, when the Spartacist uprising was crushed, and the leadership of the Spartacists, such as Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht, were killed, this created great fury and anger within the KPD, and this basically caused a massive split within the left wing. So the KPD and the SPD became mortal enemies. And this split within the left would cripple their ability to oppose the rise of the Nazis when they came to prominence within Germany. During this same period, there were 376 assassinations conducted by the right wing, and this would culminate in the Kapp-Putsch in March 1920, a right-wing attempt at revolution which collapsed under its own ineptness. Importantly, the Reichswehr, which was the German army, refused to crush this uprising when asked to by the SPD, famously stating, "Reichswehr does not fire on Reichswehr." This importantly showed the military's right-wing bias and would serve to further polarize Germany. Ultimately, the revolutions which occurred from all sides of the political spectrum showed the lack of support for Weimar. The Weimar Republic was consequently referred to as a republic without republicans, with Weimar's indifference to its own existence allowing Hitler's rapid de-democratization of Germany. Importantly, this political chaos in Weimar's early years, which was compounded by hyperinflation in 1921 and the French occupation of the Ruhr, would fuel fanatic nationalism and anti-revolutionary sentiment amongst the front generation, the veterans of World War I. These men would join the Freikorps, which later evolved into the SA, once the Nazis came to relevance in Germany. However, following the effective leadership of Gustav Stresemann, Germany seemed to appear in a golden era, right? The Weimar Republic seemed to be very stable. It had defeated hyperinflation. It had rising living standards. It had become the center of culture, literature, art, music in Europe. Everything seemed good. But this would This Weimar dream would come crushing down in 1929 with the Great Depression. During this golden era of Weimar, the Nazis faded into irrelevance. They had begun to become popular during the hyperinflation era, in which all the savings of the middle class got eroded, which due to the loss of the value of the German dollar, right? Following the golden era and the imprisonment of Hitler following the November 1923 Munich Putsch, the Nazi movement faded into irrelevancy, only to return to relevancy following the Great Depression. However, one notable omission being Hitler, who wrote Mein Kampf while in Landsberg prison, whose dramatic orations during his trial for the Putsch propelled him into a sort of semi-celebrity status. So we can see, even though the Nazis were fading into irrelevancy during this period, there was a insidious kind of popularity building around Hitler. And that would come to the front during the Great Depression. Although Weimar seemed very stable during the Golden Era, there are a number of things that pointed to the instability within Weimar, which would ultimately lead to its collapse. The first is Weimar's political instability. Given the proportional representation system, which gave one seat in the Reichstag for every 60,000 votes a party attained, this led to a lot of chaos because resultantly German elections were inefficient and resulted in many small parties gaining seats. This led to bloated and inefficient coalitions, which frequently collapsed. This point is highlighted clearly by the 21 coalition governments between 1919 to 1933. And this kind of makes the political chaos in our modern-day countries kind of seem like a joke. This led to ineffective governing, which undermined support for democracy, fueled political violence, and convinced the German people of the need for a return to a strong authoritarian leadership. Furthermore, proportional representation allowed the participation of fringe radical parties such as the Communist KPD and the Nazi Party, who would not normally win a plurality of the votes in any one seat, but had an inherent wide voter base across the nation from which they could attain those numbers, those 60,000 votes for a seat. And structurally, populism was rewarded by the proportional representation system, giving populist figures are enabled to gain a wide array of support across a nation, whereas a less populist party has to focus on structurally winning each individual seat, right, gaining popularity in one area, whereas by focusing, say, on local issues like public infrastructure or something, or parks or something like that, right? But a populist can focus on a large, wide-scale message like stop immigration, something like that, right? And that's why the Nazis were benefited by the system. So the political system allowed the Nazis to rise. Additionally, the constitution of the Weimar Republic was very weak, especially due to the power it gave the president. This is most aptly highlighted by Article 48, which was the emergency decree giving the president the ability to rule without the Reichstag. So he got the ability to rule by decree. He wasn't accountable to the parliament. He could pass whatever laws he wanted to. Now, this became important because once the German government collapsed, with the collapse of Müller's Grand Coalition in March 1930 due to the Great Depression, Hindenburg effectively ruled by presidential decree using Article 48, because none of the governments, whether Müller's SPD or Brüning's Centrum, had enough political support from the Reichstag to rule effectively. His use of Article 48 and Brüning's, who he endorsed to give the power to rule with Article 48, would undermine German democracy. And importantly, we need to note that Brüning was the Chancellor of Germany. What did this mean? This meant that when Hitler rose to power, stated the precedent of Brüning and Hindenburg's use of 48 as his own basis for the centralization of control and his rule without the Reichstag. So this would allow the consolidation of Nazi power later on. Now, another key problem during the Weimar golden eras was the perceived sense of decadence by the countryside and by the conservative elites. They believed that the new liberal democracy that was given, the new rights, the new sexual liberties, they believed these were against traditional German values. This created resentment. We can see this in a quote from Himmler, who was a chicken farmer before he became one of the most evil men in the Nazi German state. He said, "Cowards are born in towns, heroes in the country." What does this show? This is evidence of the growing animosity between the urban areas and the countryside, who became increasingly polarized and resentful of the city people, the city dwellers, who they saw as deviants. And this was a clear link to how the Nazis grew a large base of support around in the countryside, which allowed them to grow to power, because they promised to get rid of the decadence of the Weimar Republic. Additionally, we see things such as the Wandervogel movement, which was a group that wished for a return to traditional German values, such as Teutonic values, paganism, connect to nature, a rejection of industrialization. Movements like this sprung up during the decadence of the Weimar eras, and the Nazis were able to capitalize upon this to rise to power. Another key factor in the fall of the Weimar Republic was that they were inextricably linked to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles was viewed as a diktat in Germany. It was hated. It was a slave treaty, is what they saw it as. Why did they see it as this? Well, they lost a lot of territory. They lost things like Alsace-Lorraine. They lost all the colonies such as Namibia, Tanzania, North Papua New Guinea. They also had to pay crippling war reparations such as the £6.6 billion. They lost industrial equipment. The Rhineland was demilitarized. The War Guild Clause, Article 231, which humiliated Germany, 100,000 troop military limit, which insulted their Prussian military traditions. Just the Treaty of Versailles insulted and crippled Germany in every way, and it was deeply unpopular. Now, what occurred after World War I was that the military generals promoted the idea that Germany had been stabbed in the back, the Dolchstossel legend, and they promoted that they were stabbed in the back by the November criminals. And these November criminals were the Weimar politicians. The returning troops, who hadn't actually seen defeat, were bitter and angry, and they turned this resentment and anger towards the government. This would fuel the rise of radical nationalism within Germany, upon which the Nazis would be able to capitalize on this. Now, during the 1920s, there was a particular right-wing movement called the Völkisch movement. This had strong anti-Versailles sentiment, and this movement linked the Weimar Republic very deeply to the Treaty of Versailles, in particular due to their signing of the Locarno Pact in 1925, which recommitted Germany to the Versailles terms. So they were able to draw a clear link between the Weimar Republic and the Treaty of Versailles using the Locarno Pact, and the Nazis' extreme opposition to Versailles, which juxtaposed to Weimar's apparent support, grew their popularity due to the deep unpopularity of the Treaty of Versailles. The Young and Dawes Plan. Now, this is an evidence of how Hitler was able to capitalize on events in Germany and kind of get lucky upon them. He strongly opposed the Young Plan, and he actively campaigned against it. It was basically a plan. German reparations would be paid back by 1988, which was deeply unpopular in Germany, viewed as long-term enslavement. And this repayment would be basically based on American loans. He was drafted into the anti-Young campaign by Alfred Hugenberg, who owned many newspapers. This gave Hitler a large spotlight. It gave him presence throughout Germany. This also grew his popularity and legitimized him, given he was campaigning alongside conservative elites, which would be important for his future electability. Now, Hitler's strong opposition to the Young Plan, would be vindicated when the United States called in all its loans, including those from the Young Plans, and this would crash the German economy. So as you see, Hitler's strategic opposition to the Young Plan would both legitimize him and vindicate him when his opposition to the plan, which was strongly supported by the Weimar Republic, resulted in the collapse of the German economy when the US called in all its foreign loans following the Great Depression. Now, finally, we look at the Nazis' inherent appeal, right? So the Nazis, using Volksgemeinschaft, created an idea of a large German community, right, that would work together to achieve things. And this was very popular in Germany, who had kind of a tradition of this working together community thing. The Nazis had a very broad ideology that appealed to everyone, as seen in Hitler's 25-point plan, which had elements of socialism such as land reforms, abolition of inheritance, introduction of welfare provisions, which appealed to the left-wing elements of German society, the workers. It also had elements of nationalism, which appealed to basically every German, especially the right. It had strong elements of race and anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and anti-communism was very strong in Germany because the right had a deep fear that Germany would be overthrown by the left, as seen by the early communist revolutions back in the day. They also had things like Lebensraum, giving Germany living space, the superiority of the state, Volksgemeinschaft, people's communities we've already touched on, the creation of a whole German community through the inclusion of Germans and exclusion of non-Germans created a sense of belonging, which was deeply appealing to the German people. And then there's Gleichschaltung, the appearance of order, coordination within Germany. This really appealed to the German people in an era when there'd been so much disorganization, so much chaos. And finally, we have Hitler's appeal. We can never discount the natural magnetism Hitler had, his appeal in speeches, his Hitler gaze, right? People may not have really agreed with his policies, but for many Germans, there was something about him that really appealed to him, and this kind of led to his rise. His speaking and propaganda skills, the whole propaganda machine of the Nazis, kind of fueled their rise, because they were able, through their propaganda, to exploit current events. So then we move on to the Great Depression. Without the Great Depression, simply put, the Weimar Republic would not have collapsed. In the 1928 election, the Nazis won less than 3% of the vote. It's staggering to look at their increase to 37% of the vote by July 1932, in which they became the largest party in the Reichstag. Why did this happen? Well, simply put, the Great Depression was devastating for Germany when it hit in 1929. Unemployment, which peaked at 20% of the German population in 1931, was just absolutely chaotic. There were 7 million unemployed in 1932. This was devastating, and the unemployed were seeking answers, whether they went to the left with the KPD or whether they went to the right. They wanted a change. They just thought that the Weimar Republic couldn't deal with the political problems, couldn't deal with the problems Germany was facing. The 5 major banks collapsed in 1931. This destroyed people's savings. 20,000 businesses folded. This mass collapse of businesses and loss of homes as people who had mortgages had their houses liquidated by collapsing banks and were made homeless. This just absolutely crushed the middle class, who were the only supporters of Weimar. And with the loss of support for Weimar by the middle class, this just fueled the rise of the Nazis. Deep political polarization occurred, chaos, street fighting between communists and Nazis. And basically, Hitler just said, when this all occurred, I can fix this. I am the only one who can fix this. I'm the only one who can stop the communists who were rising in popularity in this support. And the conservative elites who feared the communists and saw Hitler's rising popularity thought, this is the only guy we can appoint to not lose all our money, right? To not get killed by the communists, because that was another deep fear that was occurring. Then we come to Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. It was also added by a bit of political intrigue in Weimar. Von Papen was replaced by Hindenburg with von Schlieffler as Chancellor, right? And von Schlieffler had kind of been undermining von Papen and been saying he's ineffective, he can't deal with this thing. So von Papen, enraged, hatched a plan to remove von Schlieffler and come to power as Chancellor again. He did this by convincing Hindenburg that Hitler, as leader of the most popular party, should be made Chancellor, and he himself should be made Vice-Chancellor. Von Papen's driven by jealousy, hatred, and desire for revenge against von Schlieffler, successfully undermined von Papen. And he made Hitler become Chancellor, right? Because even though Hindenburg hated Hitler, von Papen's kind of machinations and other conservative elites' efforts to kind of promote Hitler ultimately swayed his decision, and he appointed Hitler Chancellor in 30th of January 1933, with von Papen stating, Hitler will be a Chancellor in chains, and saying, we have hired him, how wrong he would be.